The National People's Congress is China's supreme organ of state power. One of these top legislative bodies' functions is to amend the constitution and oversee its enforcement. How do lawmakers view their legislative work for the past 4 years, and what are the major obstacles during the process? A deputy spoke to CCTV at the ongoing NPC session. So, Ms. Xin, this is the last year for the current NPC deputies to serve as China's lawmakers. What do you believe are the highlights of the legislative work for NPC deputies during the past year?
For past 4 years, actually, I think the past 4 years has been a peak in the NPC legislative history, and we have enacted 14 laws and the legal regulations in these 4 years. Notably, I think all the society is aware that we have passed the supervision law of the standing committees, and this law takes us for 20 years, and which is very important because it regulates the supervision power, all kinds of NPC standing committee over, we call this one government, one Supreme Court and one Procurator's office. And under this law, the NPC will have a legal base more clearly to performing its power.
And what do you believe are the focus of this year's legislative work?
You know, in this last 30 years, we put more emphasis on our lawmaking on economic reform area. The focus is put on efficiency to push economic development. But for this last year, it is clear that we'll shift our focus into a social area, which means we'll put more attention to social law making, to put attention on social harmony and social justice. So on our agenda, we have the labor contract law on review, and also we are going to have a social insurance law this year, and all these laws will give more emphasis on social justice, especially for those who are in a disadvantaged social position.
So why does it take such a long time for the NPC Standing Committee to have the draft law of the property law this time?
Yeah, it is true that it's taken for 14 years almost to have this property law, and I'm sure it will be enacted in a few days. The difficulty for this lawmaking, I think there are several reasons. First is because our economic reform is still in process, and this law, actually the mission of this law is to legalize the property owners' rights. So the development and to legalize and affirming these property rights, it's a hard job. And second, we have a lot of debate over the concept of property, and the different views and different concepts over this law has been put forward, and lots of discussions. And by now, I think the people have reached a much more consensus, and now the time for this law is there. So I think this law will be passed.
The two landmark laws of corporate income tax and property are both about the level playing field and social justice. The rise of living standards mean the general public no longer sit back to enjoy material comforts only. Rather, they would demand more of a quality public service and the supply of public goods at this stage of the social transformation. Well, welcome back to our discussion here. Quite a few years ago, the movie Qiuju Goes to Court, directed by Zhang Yimou, one of the top reps of the fifth generation of the Chinese movie makers, caused quite a stir among the Chinese, and it went big in International Movie Festival. The question about this movie is why an ordinary female peasant in a village, her determination to have a clear conviction about something that she felt was wrong, caused such a great debate throughout the whole country in those days. I mean, this led to a deep question about the general public awareness of how to use laws to protect their own individual interests. I mean, you must have lived in China for years, so what do you make of this movie and the spirit it embodies?
Well, I mean, people are fascinated by law and legal cases. People are fascinated by the David and Goliath situation where the individual takes on the machine, they take on the organization. We have those in the United States, Inherit the Wind, 12 Angry Men, movies that talk about people who are whistleblowers or people who decide to go against the grain.
But excuse me, I
yeah.
think the 12 Angry Men.
Yeah, was about the jury. That's exactly right. Yeah, we don't have a jury trial here in China. Of course it is. No, what I'm saying is, I think people are fascinated with the legal system here. There's no question about it. And I think the reason why some of the top television shows in the United States are legal shows, it's because, and even here in China, are legal programs. It's that people are fascinated with the system. Yeah. You know, there's two things you don't want to see made: sausage and law. They say that's a joke, but the truth be told is that both of them. And in 12 Angry Men, we saw how law is made. Juries make up law. It's not written laws and regulations. It's what 12 people come up and they say guilty or not guilty.
But I think, you know, for the movie Qiuju Go to the Court, the fascinating point is that traditionally, Chinese people would think that the laws are tools used by the government to rule the people. So how could the common people to sue a public official? This is a very strange thing for traditional way of thinking of Chinese people. So this is an important point. Let me tell you another story talking about the rule of law. When we're talking about rule of law, I think it's a behavior. It's a social environment. The story goes like this. A Chinese young man go to Germany for study. You know, he is not only smart, but also handsome. So he fall in love with a German girl. And they went to street one day. They were going to cross the street at the intersection. But the traffic light for pedestrian was red. The Chinese young man was looking around. There were no cars. So he crossed the street without any hesitation. The German girl was astonished. And then she said bye-bye to the young man. Her reason was that this guy is very dangerous. You know, he even dared to go against the red light. Whatever terrible thing she could not dare to do. But this is not the end of the story. You know, the young man came back to Beijing 3 years later and fall in love with a Chinese girl. And they went to the street together, and one day, accidentally, you know, at the intersection, they were going to cross the street. But the traffic light was red for the pedestrians, and there were no cars. And this time, the Chinese young girl crossed the street without any hesitation. But the young man lived in Germany for 3 years. He used to waiting for the green light. The Chinese girl was very angry and said bye-bye to him. The reason was that, you know, this guy is incapable and useless. He even not dare to go against the red light. What kind of thing he could do in future? These are two very different attitudes towards the rule of laws. But this is very important. You know, Yang Rui, you mentioned, for legislation, this is only one step for rule of law. Mm-hmm. And the more important is carry out the laws in reality, in social lives. We would say that it's much easier to make a law than to enforce the law, to apply the law in society.
Yeah, but interesting story that you bring up, because the truth be told is that pedestrians have never had the right of way in China until very recently. And so even if you're walking against the light, it's still the fault of the pedestrian and not the fault of the driver up until very recently. That was the case. Mm-hmm. The cars had the right of way. There were fewer cars. There were more people, and people had to, and cars had the right of way and not people. And so that was just a huge issue. And I did a television show on that one.
Well, I have many stories to share with you, the confusion over the behavior of the ordinary Chinese. And now, let me just tell you one of them. A couple of years ago, I was in Tokyo discussing with a Japanese diplomat about whether he would go against the red light here in Beijing. But in Tokyo, everybody says, no, you must abide by the traffic